Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, I want to dive into this piece that was published by the Bulwark. If you're not familiar with the Bulwark, it's probably one of the top independent media outlets on Substack. I would put it on par with the Free Press. But I don't know that it's necessarily liberal. It's just more of an anti-Trump, liberal aligned publication. I honestly don't know where to ideologically categorize it, but that's neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is it has a pretty substantial following on Substack. And so when they post content like this, people tend to read it and their audience likely agrees with it. And I think it's really important to start dissecting what the political opposition or what people who are ideologically opposed to you think and what they have to say about certain things and how they're framing it. Because I think one of the problems we're facing right now in the United States is that we're coexisting in these ideological media echo chambers that only reinforces what we already know to be true. And so we don't actually know what people who are ideologically unaligned with us think. We don't know what they're hearing. We don't know what the words are being used. And so this has created, I'd say, a hyper radical political environment where people believe things because facts aren't being checked, quite literally. I've been a fact checker. I can tell you for certain people who are fact checking aren't actually checking facts. But it creates this really hostile environment that is allowed to metastasize and grow. And obviously we've seen the culmination of this in political violence, most recently with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But I think this environment is continuing to get a little bit more heated. Especially with the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. I think a lot of people came out of the woodwork supporting that, and people you wouldn't expect, firefighters and ER nurses and teachers, people who you see as good, upstanding members of society, were supporting the assassination of their political opponents. And now there's new polling that has come out looking at liberals and Gen Z, and there's just a clear difference between who believes in political violence and who doesn't. So I wanted to break down this article because I think it gets at the heart of the problems we're facing in society right now, and it really underscores why political violence has been enabled to grow and take off. So this is part of Morning Shots, and the essay I want to dive into is called Trench Lawfare by Andrew Egger. And so I think this piece really encapsulates the constitutional crisis we're facing in this country right now and why people are being motivated to engage in acts of political violence. I don't think it's just you disagree with me, therefore I'm going to kill you. I think it's your beliefs are an existential threat to my life. Your beliefs are an existential threat to my continued existence in this country. Therefore, I need to do something about it. And that leads to the actions we've been seeing. And so underpinning all of this is a belief that Trump is a Nazi fascist hell-bent on establishing an authoritarian dictatorship in the United States. And so one side, one group of people really believes that to be true. And another side is just kind of looking at that like, what on earth are you talking about? So this piece, I think, right here really gets into that. So it's really all about the rule of law, and it's comparing the rule of law versus the rule of Trump. So one of the problems right off the get-go is that the writer talks about the rule of law using an abstract definition that this individual came up with. So he says the rule of law starts with the acknowledgement that both the armed agents of the state, so in this context of this piece, I would interpret that as federal law enforcement officials, specifically ICE and Department of Homeland Security, and the people they engage with, those people I would couch as protesters or folks who are out opposing those federal law enforcement activities. And the author argues that the rule of law starts with acknowledging that both these groups of people are human beings. Well, that's all well and good, but that's not actually what the rule of law is all about. So according to uscourts.gov, the rule of law is a principle under which all persons, institutions, and entities are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, and consistent with international human rights principles. So there is an element of recognizing that you are a human, I am a human, and there's mutual respect for our shared humanness. But it's not necessarily acknowledging that the other side is a human being. The rule of law is fundamentally about processes and institutions, and really it's about equal enforcement or equal application of those processes and equal representation in those institutions, and not treating people differently, right? So the principle of human rights here being, you're not going to treat someone, you're not going to give someone a different standing under the rule of law. They're not going to have different rights than you. They're not going to have different, legal standing than you, just because of the color of their skin, their gender, that kind of thing. So it's a principle that applies to people and institutions and processes. And so the problem I have with this definition, for one, it's subjective. Like, this is a well-regarded publication. More than 800,000 people read it. Like, it's journalistic sloppiness to not cite a definition. Like, to start a conversation and come up with your own announcement of how the rule of law starts and what it's applied to and who the people are within the context, so in this case, law enforcement and protesters. I mean, it's just sloppy. Like, you can pull any definition you want and link it. I've, pulled the uscourts.gov definition and noted it here. You can choose whatever definition you want. So right from the get-go, this is a highly subjective, personal interpretation of what the rule of law is. But then it starts with, the writer acknowledges, it starts with acknowledging that these people are human beings. So even if you accepted this definition as being accurate, the fact that for much of the last decade, there's been consistent use of dehumanizing language isn't consistent with this definition. So over the last decade, Trump supporters, people who voted for him, people who are politically aligned with him, have been called Nazis, have been called fascists, deplorables. Folks on the left think everyone who is a Trump voter is somehow a bumbling idiot, unworthy of life. They think Trump voters are second-class citizens. They think conservatives are second-class citizens. And there's receipts to prove this, right? Like this isn't just farcical. You can look at the media apparatus over time, and you can see how conversations have been categorized. Folks on the right have been couched as being more far right than folks on the left. You don't hear equivalent conversations about far left. Even now, talking about leftist extremism, it's largely being ignored by folks on the left. They're not willing to denounce it. They're not willing to acknowledge it. They're not willing to accept their complicity in it. And so this becomes dehumanizing because over the last decade, you have people who have consistently used this language. And Nazi is a very deliberate and specific term here, because whenever you think of the word Nazi, you think of genocide, right? And so the implication here is if someone is a Nazi, they have to be eradicated because the Nazis kill people, right? So if you call me a Nazi, your objective is to kill me, because you can't exist in a country where Nazis exist, where Nazis, people like me apparently, are allowed to run around freely. You can't coexist with those people. It's not an option. Fascism is a top-down government structure where the ideology of a supreme leader, so in Germany that was Adolf Hitler, dominates, and you surrender yourself, your individuality, to the nation. So in Germany, is your national identity, and this bigger project, you no longer exist as an individual. So it is an existential threat to folks on the left. So what they've been doing over the last decade is they've been using this language. So it started with far right, now it's become Nazi and then fascist, and anywhere you go today, you're not even a bigot anymore. Like can we at least agree on that? Like, you're not even just like a bigot or a transphobe or a racist anymore. You're a fascist and a Nazi. So over time, this has led to the social death of conservatives. This has created a permissible environment where where it is okay and justifiable to gun down conservatives. And this has been happening. And to understand this, the process of social death, and this is what happened in Germany in the 1930s, is you have young people who don't really know what's happening, who are young when things start, and then by the time they age into adulthood and they're able to take actions on their own, they can implement and carry out social death by themselves. So think about it. If you were, 10 during Trump's first presidency, when he was first elected in 2016, well, okay, today you're what, 19, 20 years old? You're a young adult. And you look at the people who are promoting acts of violence, it largely skews younger. And so these young people have existed in a media environment that perpetuates this language. And so it's led to the social death of conservatives, making their assassination and their death permissible, but it's also degraded the rule of law, because based on this definition, if we're going to use the author's definition, political opposition, political opponents are not treated as human beings. So right from the get-go, we're already dealing with an adversarial competitive relationship where the people who are the armed agents of the state, those who are carrying out federal law enforcement activities, those who are acting on behalf of the democratically elected president of the United States, those are pitted against the people who oppose them. And the people who oppose those law enforcement officials are consider themselves to be of the moral high ground because they are defeating fascists, they are defeating Nazis. And that's the environment we currently live in. So the author goes on to say, the agents themselves are humans, vulnerable to all the vices and temptations that beset those who wield power, and the people they come in contact with, this being the protesters, criminals and non-criminals alike, are humans too, with rights they must respect. So one of the problems here, and if you haven't caught on by now, this is really about migration and immigration issues. So it's about it's about federal law enforcement activities to rout out illegal migrants within sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. And so kind of coupled with this is the degradation of the criminal justice system within some of these localized communities. So it's not necessarily one and the same, but these are kind of complementary issues. The harboring of illegal migrants, and then the degradation of the criminal justice system. And so folks on the right have lost a lot of respect for municipalities and states that are soft on crime. And that's because we've seen that criminals are being given preferential treatment in the court system that puts them ahead of their victim. So just look at the Irina Zaritska murder right before Charlie Kirk's assassination. That was dominating the news. And in case you're not familiar, she was a young Ukrainian woman. I think she was 23. She was just got off a pizza shift, working at a pizzeria in Charlotte, North Carolina, got onto the light rail train, sat in the wrong section, in the wrong seat, in the wrong section of that train. A man behind her had a manic breakdown apparently and just decided to stab her, and she bled out to death on that train. And it was all caught on CCTV footage, and that was released on the internet. So, the problem with that particular case, I mean, there was a lot of problems, but the problem with that particular case is that the perpetrator of that attack had 14 prior arrests. And so had the criminal justice system been working, had criminals like that man been punished, been behind bars, she would still be alive today. And the issue isn't just this one person, is that this has happened over and over and over again. And we're only starting to see this now. And frankly, I don't think that Irina Zaritska's murder would have gotten any sort of media coverage had it not been for X and social media and people disseminating the CCTV footage, because there have been other ones as well that have come to light since then, and as different, Matt Walsh covered one of a boy who was murdered 10 years ago in Kentucky because a similar profile, a repeat criminal, had driven from Indiana to Kentucky, pulled down a random street, opened a random door of a random house that happened to be unlocked, went upstairs and killed the family's 6-year-old boy and injured some of the other kids in the house. And no prior contact, didn't know the family, nothing. Again, another example of someone who had prior arrests, should have been behind bars, but was given, I think he was released after 10 years, and that's why he was being covered on Matt Walsh's show, because justice clearly wasn't served. And so this keeps happening over and over again, but even like that case, you probably didn't hear about that when it happened. So many of these cases we're not hearing about when they happen because they're being suppressed in the media. So thanks to social media, we're now aware that this is happening. And so we're seeing a body count. We're seeing receipts. There's evidence that there are criminals who are being given preferential treatment in the court system, and that their victims, they're not being given justice. Like these are preventable crimes. If judges weren't soft on crime, if ADs weren't soft on crime, like these people would be behind bars and we wouldn't have to worry about them re-offending until they get to a point where they eventually kill someone. And so to say that criminals and non-criminals alike have rights they must respect, I think this is a little tongue-in-cheek, and it's hard for conservatives to look at this and take this seriously because we know there is a hierarchical system where criminals are now being placed above non-criminals, and it's created a two-tier system. And the same applies to illegal immigration, right? It's become very clear that illegal migrants are being placed above legal immigrants, which is just a complete affront to them, but also U.S. citizens. And so there's this hierarchical tiered nature of society where you can't possibly apply the rule of law equitably when different people have different preferential ranks and categories within that society. Okay. And again, he talks about the laws that govern both. Again, these laws aren't necessarily governing both. Like you have to have rule of law. And if you don't have rule of law, you can't maintain the humanness of the victims and you can't maintain their rights. So how can you defend Irina Zaritska's life or any other young woman taking a public transportation after a shift at work? How can you protect her rights when the people perpetrating crime are continuously allowed to be let go on the street? So that's what the author sets up as the rule of law, and there's just tons of holes in that logic, and there's receipts to prove it. So then he dives into the rule of Trump, and he talks about how this starts from a different place. He says, under this rule, the conflict between armed men of the state and the people they are deployed against is a conflict between angels and demons. And this is wild. And this is why I was saying, like, we live in these echo chambers, because anyone who has been watching the news over the last 5 years knows this is absolutely not true. And the proof of this is to compare George Floyd's death to Charlie Kirk's. After George Floyd died, people took to the streets and they didn't just protest. They rioted. They looted. They set businesses on fire. I don't know how setting a small business owner's shop on fire achieves any sort of racial justice for George Floyd, but that's how they responded, okay? There is documentation of this, not like you can observe for your own eyes. You probably have living memory of this. Like that happened, okay? Now, fast forward to most recently with Charlie Kirk's assassination. How did conservatives respond? How did even non-conservatives who were sympathetic respond? People held vigils, candlelight vigils. They put flowers. People erected like memorials. Outside Turning Point USA, there was a memorial. They held a massive service for him inside of an arena. No businesses were looted. Nothing was set on fire. Nothing was burned to the ground. Police didn't have to, come into contact with protesters. No one was wearing gas masks. Like a totally different response, right? And so he's saying here that the conflict between armed men of the state, so federal law enforcement officials, and the people they are deployed against, protesters, is a conflict between angels and demons. And the argument here is that the protesters are the angels, and the men of the state, the federal law enforcement officials, are demons. But there's evidence to show that the response from the protesters and how it varies and why it's completely different, it shows like this is completely farcical. I would argue people who loot and riot and set fire to things are demons. They're not angels. And so when you look at what's happening with regard to the anti-migration protests that are happening now, because that's what the context of this is. I mean, similar things. You have people who threw bricks at police officers in Los Angeles over the summer during protests there. You have people who are shooting at ICE facilities with the intent on killing federal law enforcement officials. I mean, you can look at video footage from what's going on in Portland. And I've been to Portland. Like, I was not impressed, okay? I visited Portland in 2021, and I lasted not even 5 hours in the city. I was planning on staying there for a while. And I was just shocked. Just everything you've heard about Portland, it was true. People on the streets, tent cities, things boarded up. It just did not seem like a safe place to be. So it's not surprising to me that right now there's a ton of anti-government protests happening in Portland right now. But just use your own eyes. Watch footage. Check out Nick Shirley on YouTube. He's a young man who's been going to the front lines of a lot of these protests, documenting things, just asking people questions. He had someone threaten him. A protester threatened his life in his most recent video. You have these protesters who are showing up with devices that can be used as weapons. So yeah, they're waving flags, often of another country, but those flags can be used as weapons. And that actually happened to a reporter. A journalist was butted in the head with a flagpole that one of these protesters was carrying. So they're not peaceful. They're not angels. There are some bad stuff happening with these protests. Okay, so he concludes this paragraph by saying, meanwhile, the people who object to his will, meaning Trump's will, whenever, wherever, are dangerous insurgents who must be rooted out. Again, this is dehumanizing language, and it suggests that right now federal law enforcement is just willy-nilly categorizing people as criminals, and that they're on a mission against these angelic beings, and that they are wrongly being persecuted, and that these angelic protesters are being misrepresented as dangerous insurgents, and that the Trump administration is circumventing the rule of law to root them out. And this is framing it as an existential battle. But I think if you just look at the evidence around you, this has been completely flipped on its head. And the evidence you need to look at is how many anti-Trump liberals have died for their beliefs in the last year or two versus how many pro-Trump conservatives. How many pro-Trump conservatives have given their lives, or not even pro-Trump conservatives either, just people who don't align with the ideology of the left. How many people have died? How much property has been damaged? How many people have been arrested and imprisoned? There's an actual count here. You have, the CEO, the United Healthcare CEO, who's gunned down. You have the Israeli embassy workers who were gunned down by a Free Palestine protester in Washington, D.C. You have Charlie Kirk's assassination. You have the 2 attempts that were made on Donald Trump's life. You have multiple people here who have been gunned down for no reason at all. And then you've obviously had the Tesla takedown protest. You had the arson attack at Josh Shapiro's home. And then, most recently you've had people being arrested. So Nick Sorter, which he'll reference later in this piece, but he was arrested in the Portland protests. You have receipts for conservatives who are being rooted out literally by the left. Now flip it on its head. How is that also true on the right? Are people on the right, are pro-Trump people, is the government going out and killing people, rooting out dangerous insurgents for their beliefs? The only example I can think of is the assassination of the Democratic state lawmakers in Minnesota over the summer. But even that, the way it's been framed in the media, is I don't have a complete picture anymore of what happened. So when the news broke, I was following it. People seem to think that, folks on the right and people who question leftist ideology aren't watching the news. That's why I'm doing this video and recording this analysis of the Bulwark, because I too am trying to understand how my political opposition views the world and where we can find common ground, if there is common ground, but how they view the world. I want to see how they view me, how they view the world. Okay. So I was watching live coverage when that happened. And immediately it was framed as the perpetrator had worked for Tim Walz. He had No Kings protests flyers in his car, and that was the same weekend of the No Kings protests. And there was reports that he was angry because there had been a vote cast a few days before to end Minnesota care for illegal migrants. And so Melissa Hortman, who was one of the deceased victims, she was the deciding vote, and she was a Democratic lawmaker who voted with the Republicans of the state of Minnesota to end illegal healthcare for illegal migrants. That being said, I also acknowledge that the other victim, I believe it was John Hoffman, didn't have the same voting record. I'm not quite sure why this perpetrator targeted him. And there was also a list of other people. I don't know the people on that list. So I don't know who he was going after. Was it just Democratic lawmakers? Were there other people on the mix? Like, I don't know. No one knows. They haven't really released that information to my knowledge. Okay. But over the past few months, the narrative has changed. So it's been framed now as, he was a conservative Christian MAGA Trump supporter who was anti-abortion. And the reason why he attacked these people had to do with abortion. And I don't buy that, only because historically, people who have committed political acts of violence with regard to abortion have typically targeted providers and facilities engaged in abortion. So to my knowledge, no political lawmaker has been attacked for their beliefs on abortion, but clinics and doctors providing abortions in the past have, typically with bombings. That was how it was done, I think, in like the 80s and 90s. So unless there's a manifesto or some sort of evidence that supports that argument, I find it hard to believe that someone would just spontaneously create a list. And again, there were other names on the list that he had. So who were these people, and did they share the same? Like, was there a pro-abortion caucus in the Minnesota state government? Like, there's just a lot of open-ended questions, and I don't have answers. And the conversation contradicts pre-existing evidence or pre-existing information that suggests he was opposed to how Melissa Hortman voted. And the only reason why I could potentially buy that argument that he would murder her because of how she voted with regard to Minnesota Care is because we're kind of seeing something similar happen in the federal government right now. I've done a whole separate video on this. But the reason why the government shutdown is happening is not because of ACA subsidies. It's because there is a clause within the Democrats' proposal that would end a requirement that was implemented with the One Big Beautiful Bill that requires states to provide proof of citizenship of people they provide healthcare assistance to in order to receive federal Medicaid dollars. And that's what this is all about, right? It's about federal government response to illegal migrants and like their jurisdiction over the states and how that is handled. So if the Democrats are willing to nuke the government over that, like, I could reasonably see someone getting very upset and taking an action of political violence against someone. Whereas like the abortion stuff has been going on for a while, and it's really hard for me to draw that conclusion. I'm open to evidence. Like, if you know something I don't and you have evidence, please, by all means, share it with me. I just haven't seen it. But I share that because that's the only case, the Melissa Hortman case in Minnesota, that's the only case of political violence that has resulted in the death of a Democrat. And even then, if she voted in opposition to extending health care to illegal migrants, like, how much of a Democrat was she? She wasn't like ideologically captured like a lot of the other ones. So even then, I have questions. But you're not seeing the same acts of political violence being carried out against Democrats. And so, like, how can it possibly be true that Trump is going after people who object to his will and rooting out dangerous insurgents when the body count is far higher on the right, on his team, if you want to go that route and you call it a team, that folks there's been more damage, more harm, more death to folks on the right than on the left. I think the receipts and the evidence speaks for itself. Okay. So it says here that Trump goes out of his way to start conflicts. And again, I think this is misrepresenting and mischaracterizing what is actually happening. So the issue at hand is the deployment of National Guard and federal law enforcement officials to cities across the country that have basically been acting in subordination to the will of the federal government. So under our system, the federal government has supremacy over the states. So anything that's left to the states is the states. That's the 10th Amendment. But everything else is the federal government. So the federal government is responsible for border security. It's responsible for national defense. And so if you see the migrant crisis as an invasion, a foreign invasion, which frankly it kind of is, or if, the federal agencies responsible for processing immigration, that falls under the jurisdiction of the federal government, not the states. States don't issue their own visas. They don't issue work permits. They have consulates, yes. Border states might have immigration checkpoints, but there are no like Ellis Island equivalents, for Cheyenne, Wyoming, right? That there are designated ports of entry for people to come into the country, if you're, legal or otherwise, and there's a process you have to follow. And so that hasn't been happening for the past few years. We've seen an influx of illegal migrants into the country. Again, just look at the evidence around you. Look at all the physical presence of them, the crime that has gone up in cities, the arrest records. Like, it's clear people are in this country who should not be here, and they are doing things that they should not be doing that is impacting the ability of American people and American citizens to go about their daily lives, right? If you are at risk of dying on an American highway because an illegal migrant is behind the wheel of a vehicle, whether that's a personal vehicle or a commercial truck, as we saw in Florida, you're at risk. So that's going to affect your ability to live your life, engage in economic activities, what have you. So this falls under the president's purview. He was democratically elected. I think folks on the left seem to forget that. That 77 million people voted for him. And so this is the mandate he has been given by the people who elected him to get illegal migrants out of the country. They do not belong here. They do not have permission to be here. And many of them are criminals. And they are committing acts of violence that are adversely affecting American citizens and legal immigrants. And that's an important caveat here. So Title 10 gives the president permission to deploy the National Guard to enforce federal laws. This is especially true in cases of insurrection or insubordination. So if he feels that the state and local leaders of certain areas are not aligned with the federal government, they're acting in contradiction to the laws that are being, the guidance that's being put out at the federal level, like, he has the legal authority, according to Title 10, to deploy the National Guard. And so this is being framed here as him going out of his way to start conflicts in order to justify deploying the National Guard. It completely ignores the context of why he feels the need to deploy the National Guard and the bigger issue of immigration being under the jurisdiction of the federal government, not the states, not individual cities. So if Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass out in California want to govern in a certain way that reflects, what Californians want, that is up to them. But as a member of the United States of America, they fall under the Constitution of the United States and the laws of this country, and they cannot act in contradiction to the federal government and create safe harbors for illegal migrants to live and thrive. And that's basically what's been happening. But it also applies to, and this is why I said these are kind of complementary issues with the soft on crime judges in these areas as well. So not only are sanctuary cities allowing illegal migrants to reside within their communities unchecked, and then they're able to disperse throughout the country, potentially to other areas where they're not as friendly to illegal migrants. These same cities are also soft on crime. So the same thing is happening with criminals. They're not prosecuting them, not allowing them to, they're not being locked up behind bars. And so these people are allowed to reside in public, and there's nothing containing them to those communities. So whatever Los Angeles does, whatever Karen Bass does in Los Angeles, it has consequences across the rest of the country, right? This is why the federal government matters. And this is why the jurisdiction of immigration and border control matters and falls to the federal government. Because just because California wants to do one thing, doesn't mean people in Texas want that same thing. And so in order for you to have the rule of law, you need to have continuity of how laws and processes and institutions are applied. And if California has one set of standards and Texas has another, you can't possibly have rule of law. At that point, you're going to have to start seeing state level border closures in order to prevent the flow of migrants and criminal activity across state lines. And I think that could possibly be the direction we're heading in. So deployment of the National Guard is an attempt to reassert and not reassert, but just assert federal supremacy over state and local level actions. And frankly, get things under control. It's clear, anyone who is intervening in law enforcement activities, that's a problem. That's huge problem. Like these DHS, ICE, these people have been deployed to communities for a particular reason. They're not just disappearing people. This isn't, Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. These people have criminal records. They are here illegally, which by nature makes them a criminal. If you are working in this country without proper documentation, you are also committing a crime because you're probably using a stolen social security number. And yes, I have empathy and sympathy for these people. I think a lot, frankly, we're told things and promised things by cartel members and coyotes and people who are part of the human trafficking and smuggling, and then they come into this country and then they have a debt they owe to the cartels and they have to find a way to pay it back. So I'm not necessarily blaming the people who are working and they're trying. I understand they're in a tough situation, but if you need, the rule of law is to apply. You can't have preferential treatment for some groups of people and not others. And if I were to go to a foreign country and start working illegally under the table or with false papers, I would be arrested, I would be deported, right? And so the same standard has to apply here as well. Okay, so he goes on to say, you've got to teach these criminals, he says, that's the only way they understand. And he's absolutely right. And I don't know why, like here it's insinuating that you have to teach these criminals through acts of violence. So it's like violence begets more violence. But really what this is all about is you have to have accountability and consequences. If you come into the United States illegally, if you commit a crime and you're not held accountable, you're going to keep doing it over and over again. And we see the evidence of this. That's why the guy who killed Irina Zaritska had 14 priors. Because he kept doing it over and over again. His mom even called the police department in Charlotte or Mecklenburg County and was like, my son is out of control. He has schizophrenia. Like, he needs to be behind bars. And she was even, like, she was out of options, okay? And so, at some point you have to hold people accountable. And what we were seeing in these blue cities is that people aren't being held accountable. People are allowed to continue acting with impunity, and that puts the lives of average Americans at risk. Irina Zaritska was a Ukrainian, possibly, I think, a refugee from the war over in Ukraine. I think she came here in 2020. But she was working in a pizzeria. She was I don't know if she's an American citizen, but she was here in the United States. She was going to a job, doing her work, trying to go home. And she was killed for it. You have other people who've been killed on the job. You have people who are vacationing, killed on the highway, when trucks make illegal U-turns. Like, this is adversely affecting the lives of every single American. It's increased our risk of just existing in this country. And the crazy part is we're paying taxes. We're like trying to be contributing members of society, and we can't because all this is happening. Like, it's creating a really adverse operating environment for a lot of people. And this is something, again, I live in Texas, and this is something I think about frequently. It's like, I don't know who's on the roads. I don't know if they're insured, and every time you get behind the wheel of a vehicle, like, it's not necessarily that the risk is different, because anytime you get behind the wheel of a vehicle, like, there's a risk, but it feels higher. It feels higher in a place where you don't know who the other people are on the roadways, and because it is a border state, you don't know if all the people are legally allowed to be driving. You don't know who these people are. So it definitely increases the risk. So there has to be consequences. There has to be accountability. And that's how the rule of law and how you trust institutions, that's how it's applied. There's consequences for actions. It's applied to everyone, not a hierarchy of people where some people it's applied to and other people it's not. So the author goes on to say, criminals are whoever Trump say they are. No. Criminals are people who break the law. And I think people on the left don't understand that even if you come here as an asylum seeker, you're still, if you do it illegally, if you don't go through the right processes, you're still a criminal. And I don't understand, like, the whole, like, these myopic echo chambers with the immigration debate. Because, again, I rely on observational, empirical evidence. Like, you show me a news story of someone who is, at one of these migrant hotels in a city like New York City, people who are being deported and detained, sent to Alligator Alcatraz. You see like NBC News coverage of people on these big cargo planes being deported and sent to overseas. They're all military age men. I think there have been a couple exceptions where I've seen some younger women, but we're not seeing kids being shackled. We're not seeing mothers and families being shackled. They're not being separated like they were under past administrations. We're seeing military age men. And I think the folks on the left are trying to gaslight us by suggesting that these people are just benevolent asylum seekers, when in reality, like, military age men are absolutely not. If they've committed a crime, and many are part of cartels, and we see the evidence of this, again, just look at the empirical evidence, look at the change in crime over time. I think people today are normalizing things in big cities that just a decade ago weren't normal. Like, I lived in Washington, D.C. From 2014 to 2019, and it was not normal to have to go to like a CVS and ask someone to unlock a plexiglass barrier to buy something. Like the idea of having to ask someone to unlock like a freezer case so I could buy a pint of Ben and Jerry's is just anathema. I can't even imagine that. But something in New York City, and this was one of the things that I covered this with the deployment of the National Guard in Washington, D.C., is that crime has changed dramatically over time. And I think folks on the left just kind of ignore it, or they pass it off, and they've normalized it. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I lived in Southeast for a period of time. I lived in Logan Circle, and I spent a lot of time in Georgetown. Not selfishly, but I had a parking pass that made it possible for me to park in Georgetown for free. And I worked at a co-working space out there. So it just made sense. I would just go to Georgetown all the time and hang out. And so I never once feared that I was going to get carjacked. I never once feared like my physical body was going to be harmed. I never encountered people just running into Lululemon and just grabbing as much stuff as they could and shoving in their bags and running off. Like these crime organizations that you're seeing right now with retail theft, like, to my memory, that was never a thing. People committed petty larceny all the time. Sure, like they would steal things, but it wasn't as organized as it is now. And there weren't like carjackings. And that has changed in the last few years. I mean, I think I read an article, Biden's granddaughter was like carjacked, or one of her security detail were carjacked in Georgetown, right? Carjackings started happening in Georgetown. That's not normal. And you can look at this across any city. San Francisco, Los Angeles. Cash Jordan does a really good job covering this in New York City. But again, you see over time, there's been a change where you can't shop anymore. Everything's under lock and key. Retail theft has gone up. Other types of crimes have gone up. So moped thefts, people stealing like iPhones and that kind of thing. You're seeing all this kinds of stuff happening. And so like, you can't make this stuff up. Like, where does this come from? There's clearly a correlation between the arrival of migrants, many of whom are largely military age men, many of whom also have cartel and gang affiliations, and the proliferation of like crime and new types of crime that really didn't exist at levels that exist now just a few years ago. And so I think these people are criminals, and if it were true that Trump is just arresting people all willy-nilly, that ICE is going after people all willy-nilly, show me the women and children. It's that simple. Show me the women and children who are being detained and deported. Until then, it makes sense to me that a lot of these guys probably are criminals just based on the demographics of who you're seeing. Okay, so it says you've got to teach these. Sorry, I read that already. Okay, he says under the law, it's the latter. Oh, sorry. Let me back up a bit. So he says a left-wing activist brings an American flag to a protest and lights it on fire. A MAGA content creator snatches it away and scuffle breaks out. So this is with regard to Nick Sorter recently being arrested in Portland. So he says, under the law, it's the latter who has erred. Burning a flag with you own is protected speech, and you can't take someone else's flag just because you think they're mistreating it. So I think there's a debate to be made here. So according to the Supreme Court, in 1989, a 5-4 decision said that burning a flag was protected free speech. However, Trump recently issued an executive order that gave the Justice Department the green light to start prosecuting people who are arresting the American flag under the auspices that is inciting violence and political violence. So I think there's an argument to be made here, like, should Trump be issuing executive orders? Maybe not. But here's the test of this that I think is really important. So according to this person, burning a flag you own is protected speech, okay? And you can't take someone else's flag just because you think they're mistreating it. Now, let's test this and apply it to the LGBTQ rainbow trans flag. If I were to take that flag to a protest and burn it, would it be considered free speech? Would I be protected? Would I be okay to do that, or would I be violently assaulted? Well, this has already been tested. When was this? This was back in earlier this year, over the summer. 4 people were arrested, and they could be charged with hate crimes because they destroyed LGBTQ pride flags. And so it's clear, like, the rule of law does not apply. And this is a great example because you cannot take something, a symbol, a flag, and have one application to it, and then take another flag and have a different application based on your political ideology. According to this person, it's okay to burn an American flag. That's an act of free speech. But if I were to take the rainbow flag and burn that, it would be a hate crime, okay? So it's inequitable, unequal application of the law. And so how can you have a rule of law when that creates a two-tier justice system? When the things I do, the things I say could be considered hate speech. My words could be considered violence and then merit violence in return. Whereas folks who act on the other side, their speech is protected. Their speech is encouraged. And their speech is lauded. And I think that is the discrepancy we're seeing here. And this really highlights how the rule of law has degraded over time. And so he adds a note here that the content creator's was arrested for disorderly conduct. I don't know when this was published with regard to like latest breaking news, but the DA refused to charge Nick Sorter because there wasn't any evidence. Like, it was all documented on footage. Like, you can go watch, videos. He put it all on his X feed. But there's absolutely nothing they could hold him on. Like, they couldn't try him on anything. And so that really tells you how, again, the rule of law is being applied, even without evidence. Like, someone like Nick Sorter could be arrested. There was a woman from the Post-Millennial who was assaulted in similar protests in Portland. She received a black eye, and she was blamed for giving herself a black eye, right? So how can you have equitable rule of law when there's no accountability for perpetrators of crimes? And then the people who are victims, like, they have no recourse, right? You begin to lose faith in the systems. You begin to lose trust in the institutions, and you begin to lose respect for your fellow citizen. And that's where we're at now. Okay, so it goes on to say Trump can't actually order flag burners to prison, of course. And he's not. And I think this is what it's been misconstrued. It's like, okay, anything you do against Trump's will, you're just going to go to prison willy-nilly. Like, in a true fascist regime, like a Nazi level regime, you would have a Gestapo. We do not have that. There is no party line where I can call on my neighbor and say my neighbor's doing X, Y, and Z, and a mysterious Stasi or Gestapo van is going to show up and unmarked guys are going to jump out and come and get you. Like, that's not happening. American citizens aren't being arrested willy-nilly. There is no Gestapo. There is no Stasi. There's no secret police. People aren't being disappeared to stadiums where they're being summarily executed. Like, those are things that happened in the past under authoritarian regimes that are not happening here. So what is actually happening is, yes, Trump issued an executive order about flag burning as it relates to incitement of violence, and he has given the Attorney General in Washington the permission and power to go and prosecute those who are arrested for burning flags. And then it is up to the institutions, the court of law, a judge, and a jury to determine if that person is guilty or not. Okay? But it goes through the rule of law. So Trump is not circumventing the rule of law. He is using the rule of law. But the problem here with this is because folks on the left have cast anyone who supports Trump, anyone who is in the Trump administration, as a Nazi, as a fascist, as someone who is trying to instill an authoritarian regime into the United States. They do not see people who are acting on his behalf as legitimate, good faith actors. So they do not see the Attorney General as the rule of law. They do not see that at all. They do not see that as the Justice Department as a legal institution and the processes therein as the rule of law. They see that as an extension of Trump. They see that as part of the evil and nefarious plot to take over the United States. So in the same way that conservatives have lost trust and faith and respect in the institutions because they're not holding people accountable, folks on the left have likewise also lost trust, faith in institutions because they see those as political extensions of the Trump regime. And they think it's just authoritarianism has permeated into the federal bureaucracy. So again, this is how the rule of law is breaking down, because there is no faith, and for different reasons. Like the left and right are coming at this completely separately. But there's no faith in institutions to carry out the processes as they're supposed to be carried out. And then there's no faith that those processes will be carried out in a way that leads to equitable justice for everyone. Okay. So this goes on to talk about like Trump sending in the National Guard into Oregon, and now he is circumventing an order from one of his own appointed judges. And this is something like I've been taking issue with, and I've been hearing a lot on the left, people talk about all these court injunctions, and this judge said this and this judge said that. And this gets at the heart of this and why it's an issue of federalism versus states and who has jurisdiction over immigration issues. Because I don't know when this happened, but at some point something happened where judges all of a sudden have the ability to supersede the orders of the president. Like, we currently live in a society where some random judge in Portland who none of us know, I didn't vote for, I've never met, know nothing about her, can order an injunction to stop the president from taking actions. We've already established Title 10 gives him the authority to deploy the National Guard, especially in cases of insubordination and insurrection at the state level. So he has the authority to do that. And so you have these unelected district judges who are putting injunctions forward to stop him from doing things. And in doing so, it's impacting the ability of the federal government to carry out law enforcement activities, and it's impacting the federal government's ability to implement policies regarding to migration and the border. And so this is also representative of a degradation of the rule of law, and it really shows a deterioration of federalism itself, as you have states up until now and cities that have been able to act with impunity. They're still receiving federal tax dollars, by the way, for all their programs that they're using to help benefit migrant populations. But they are acting in subordination to the federal government, to the wishes of the American people, but they're still expecting the rest of us to subsidize them. And then you have these judges in these districts who are interfering with the president's ability to do his job. And so at what point have we decided that, this is the process moving forward? And this is what's happening, is the facts on the ground have changed. So how the criminal justice system, how DAs and how district court judges and how all these people do their job is impacting how the rule of law is applied. So it can't possibly be equitably applied when a district judge that none of us know in Portland, Oregon is able to make decisions that interfere with the decisions being made by the president that the rest of us democratically elected. Okay, so it concludes by saying, so what to make of this moment? Is it foreboding, of course? And yet, Trump's defiance of the spirit, but not the letter of Judge Emerson's order, is a small consolation. So again, if we live in a country that is truly governed by the rule of law, and if the rule of Trump is threatening the rule of law, why does a district judge have more power than a democratically elected president? I think that's a fantastic test of this. If Trump is really the evil bad guy, why are states, why are cities, mayors, and governors and district court judges allowed to make decisions that supersede the decisions of the federal government and the president who leads the federal government? I think that right there is evidence of a breakdown in the rule of law. But I think this gets at something much, much bigger. And that's what he goes on to say here. So the White House has already backed away from flirting with open defiance of the courts once this term binning, I don't know what that word is, but binning its place to render migrants by the truckload to foreign prisons without due process. And I think this is the heart of what this is all about. So yes, I think the illegal migration issue is a problem. I think soft on crime judges and judicial systems and local municipalities is a problem. But what this is really all about, and what this gets at, is how does the rule of law apply to citizens versus non-citizens of a country? And in this case, how does the Constitution, as the binding document that governs the rule of law in this country, how does the Constitution apply to people who are citizens and legal residents or legal immigrants of a country versus people who are foreign aliens? Like, does an illegal migrant, someone who just walked across the southern border, or someone who even overstayed a visa for that matter, do they have the same rights as I do as an American citizen? And if they do, what are they entitled to? So I think we're facing, frankly, a constitutional crisis right now because of this, because we don't have an agreement on definitions. We've lost faith in our institutions. There's been a breakdown between the federal and the states and who has supremacy over federal jurisdiction. But then also we're seeing misalignment in the 14th Amendment and how it's being applied. According to folks on the left, if you come here illegally, you are guaranteed all the provisions, all the same things. You're guaranteed due process that an American citizen is given. Okay. However, we're also seeing that the American citizens aren't being given their due process either, because we're seeing a hierarchical system that has emerged where people who are criminals, people who are here illegally, people who have done bad things are given preferential treatment within the criminal justice system and within the court of law. And you see this with people interfering with the attempts for ICE and DHS and law enforcement to carry out their arrests. You have protesters who are acting in defiance and they are standing in their way. So how do I, as an American citizen who voted for Trump, have due process when there are people who are bad faith actors who are interfering with the very law enforcement activities that I voted for as an American citizen, right? So this is what it gets at. It's what is the 14th Amendment? How does it apply to different types of people within a physical territory? Like, yeah, just because you are here in the United States, that doesn't mean that law applies to you. And a great example is I lived in the Middle East. And so if you're not familiar, there's several countries in the Gulf that are governed by Sharia law. And so, yes, in a lot of those places, you have to be respectful and mindful. But there's some leeway, right? So there's American compounds, for example, in Saudi Arabia that, you can go buy alcohol. If you're in a hotel in Dubai, there's certain exceptions to certain Sharia law rules, right? And it's complex and it creates challenges for foreigners. And I'm not saying that foreigners haven't been caught up in things. But there's caveats and differences, right? And so if you're an American or if you're a visitor or you're someone on a work visa, there are laws, but you're not necessarily treated as a Saudi citizen under those laws, if that makes sense. You're not going to be stoned to death for drinking alcohol at a party function on your compound in Jeddah, right? Hopefully not, but otherwise people wouldn't be working there. But for all intents and purposes, like you're not going to be stoned to death. So that's I think a good corollary. So you have countries where there are certain religious laws that apply, and that is the basis of their rule of law. But it doesn't necessarily, those laws, not all of them, apply to non-citizens and don't apply to visitors. I mean, could the same be said or be true here? Does the Constitution apply to people who are non-citizens? Should someone who is here on a student visa be allowed to promote a terrorist organization and advocate for them? I lived in Jordan, and so Jordan isn't as conservative as the Gulf countries, but there are certain rules. Like you can't speak ill of the king and his family. There are certain things like you can't do. Christianity isn't prohibited. There are Orthodox churches there, but it's also like you can't really go around evangelizing either. So you're not going to see street preachers in Jordan. It's kind of like church planting there is kind of hush hush. So if I, as a student on a Jordanian campus, started preaching the gospel, like just imagine any street preacher on a U.S. campus. They have the signs that say like, do you know where if you're going to heaven or hell today? You've probably seen these types of people. Like if I did that on a Jordanian college campus, I would definitely have been arrested and most certainly been deported and stripped of my student visa. Okay, so the same thing should and could apply here, and this is what we're debating. This is the question: is who is afforded the rights and benefits and protections of the Constitution, and who is not, and where's the line there? Is it just people who are physically present in this country, or is it people who have legal standing, people who are citizens, people who are permanent residents, actual asylum seekers? Do those people have legal standing under the Constitution? And then, of course, if it's decided that people who are physically here don't necessarily have legal standing, does that mean that they're owed due process? Like, do you need to send all of these migrants, these people who are gang members and criminals, like, do you need to put them before a judge? Or is it permissible just to deport them? As you know, the Trump administration has been doing. And so I think this really gets at, you know, the Constitution, who it applies to, and then obviously getting states in lockstep with the federal government. And that clearly has not been happening. So I think this really highlights the breakdown of the rule of law and why things are so hostile and why the political culture right now in the United States is so hostile. Because we're not living in the same media echo chambers. We're not using the same vocabulary to describe things. Even, you know, talking about this with the rule of law, the person who wrote this piece couldn't bring a mutually agreed upon definition of the rule of law to the conversation. And then it's being framed in such a way that it uses existentialist, dehumanizing language where it's a zero-sum game of good versus evil and you have to vanquish all of the bad guys. And conservatives are being cast as the bad guy because Trump is the leader that must be, you know, he's aspiring to be the supreme leader that must be vanquished. And this is really all it's about. It's all about anti-Trumpism and creating this myth that he is trying to become an authoritarian in order to impose, ironically, fascism into this country. So the people who say the thing are usually the ones doing the thing. So I think that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. But I wanted to cover this because, again, I think it's important to understand how people are looking at this and look at their media diet in order to show why they believe certain things and why they see certain things the way they do, and to recognize that we are in a constitutional crisis, no doubt, but the definition of what that constitutional crisis is and how it's defined, we're not on the same page. Like, we don't even have the same agreement on what it even looks like. And so I think this really encapsulates kind of what's going on in the United States right now, especially at just a very structural and fundamental level when it comes to rule of law. So if you appreciate this video, I would love it if you would subscribe, share your thoughts and comments below. And I appreciate you watching. I'll see you on the next one.